Hi, hello. Let's see. I am all set up on Twitter. I am all set up everywhere else. Beautiful. Let's get right into it. Prologue. Shade of Fear. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. A tall shade lifted his head and sniffed the air. He looked human, except for his crimson hair and maroon eyes. He blinked in surprise. The message had been correct. They were here. Or was it a trap? He weighed the odds and then said icily, "Spread out, hide behind trees and bushes, stop whoever is coming, or die." Around him shuffled 12 Urgles with short swords and round iron shields painted with black symbols. They resembled men with bowed legs and thick, brutish arms made for crushing. A pair of twisted horns grew above their small ears. The monsters hurried into the brush, grunting as they hid. Soon the rustling quieted and the forest was silent again. The shade peered around a thick tree and looked up the trail. It was too dark for any human to see, but for him the faint moonlight was like sunshine streaming between the trees. Every detail was clear and sharp to his searching gaze. He remained unnaturally quiet, a long pale sword in his hand. A wire-thin scratch curved down the blade. Sorry, that was my cat. The weapon was thin enough to slip between a pair of ribs, yet stout enough to hack through the hardest of armor. The Urgles could not see as well as the shade. They groped like blind beggars fumbling with their weapons. An owl screeched, cutting through the silence. No one relaxed until the bird flew past. Then the monsters shivered in the cold night, and one snapped a twig with his heavy boot. The shade hissed in anger, and the Urgle shrank back motionless. He suppressed his distaste, and they smelled like fetid meat and turned away. They were tools, nothing more. The shade forced back his impatience as the minutes became hours. The scent must have wafted far ahead of its owners. He did not let the Urgles get up or warm themselves. He denied himself those luxuries too, and stayed behind the tree, watching the trail. Another gust of wind rushed through the forest. The smell was stronger this time, and excited, he lifted a thin lip in a snarl. "Get ready," he whispered, his whole body vibrating. The tip of his sword moved in a small circle. It had taken many plots and much pain to bring himself to this moment. It would not do to lose control now. Eyes brightened under the Urgle's thick brows, and the creatures gripped their weapons tighter. Ahead of them, the shade heard a clink as something hard struck a loose stone. Faint smudges emerged from the darkness and advanced down the trail. 3 white horses with riders cantered toward the ambush, their heads held high and proud, their coats rippling in the moonlight like liquid silver. On the first horse was an elf with pointed ears and elegantly slanted eyebrows. His build was slim but strong like a rapier. A powerful bow was strung across his back. A sword pressed against his side, opposite a quiver of arrows fletched with swan feathers. The last rider had the same fair face and angled features as the other. He carried a long spear in his right hand and a white dagger at his belt. A helm of extraordinary craftsmanship, wrought with amber and gold, rested on his head. Between those two, a raven-haired elven lady who surveyed her surroundings with poise. Framed by long black locks, her deep eyes shone with a driving force. Her clothes were unadorned, yet her beauty was undiminished. At her side was a sword, and on her back a long bow with a quiver. She carried in her lap a pouch that she frequently looked at, as if to reassure herself that it was still there. One of the elves spoke quietly, but the shade could not hear what was said. The lady answered with obvious authority, and her guard switched places. The one wearing the helm took the lead, shifting his spear to a readier grip. They passed the shade's hiding place and the first few Urgles without suspicion. The shade was already savoring his victory when the wind changed direction and swept towards the elves, heavy with the Urgle's stench. The horses snorted with alarm and tossed their heads. The riders stiffened, eyes flashing from side to side, and then wheeled their mounts around and galloped away. The lady's horse surged forward, leaving her guards far behind. Forsaking their hiding, the Urgles stood and released a stream of black arrows. The shade jumped out from behind the tree, raised his right hand, and shouted. A red bolt flashed from his palm toward the elven lady, illuminating the trees with a bloody light. It struck her steed, and the horse toppled with a high-pitched squeal, plowing into the ground chest first. She leapt off the animal with inhuman speed and landed lightly, then glanced around for her guards. The Urgle's deadly arrows quickly brought down the 2 elves. They fell from the noble horses, blood pooling in the dirt. As the Urgles rushed to the slain elves, the Shade screamed, "After her! She is the one that I want!" The monsters grunted and rushed down the trail. A cry tore from the elf's lips as she saw her dead companions. She took a step towards them, and then cursed her enemies and bounded into the forest. While the Urgles crashed through the trees, the Shade climbed a piece of granite that jutted above them. From his perch, he could see all of the surrounding forest. He raised his hand and uttered, and a quarter-mile section of the forest exploded into flames. Grimly, he burned one section after another until there was a ring of fire, a half-league across around the ambush site. The flames looked like a molten crown resting on the forest. Satisfied, he watched the ring carefully in case it should falter. The band of fire thickened, contracting the area the Urgles had to search. And suddenly the Shade heard shouts and a coarse scream. Through the trees, he saw 3 of his charges fall in a pile, mortally wounded. He caught a glimpse of the elf running from the remaining Urgles. She fled towards the craggy piece of granite at a tremendous speed. The Shade examined the ground 20 feet below, and then jumped and landed nimbly in front of her. She skidded around and sped back to the trail. Black Urgle blood dripped from her sword, staining the pouch in her hand. The horned monsters came out of the forest and hemmed her in, blocking the only escape routes. Her head whipped around as she tried to find a way out, and seeing none, she drew herself up with a regal disdain. The Shade approached her with a raised hand, allowing himself to enjoy her helplessness. "Get her." As the Urgles surged forward, the elf pulled open the pouch, reached into it, and let it drop to the ground. In her hands was a large sapphire stone that reflected the angry light of the fires. She raised it over her head, and lips forming frantic words. Desperate, the Shade barked out. A ball of red flame sprang from his hand and flew towards the elf fast as an arrow, but he was too late. A flash of emerald light briefly illuminated the forest, and the stone vanished. Then the red fire smote her, and she collapsed. The Shade howled in rage and stalked forward, flinging his sword at a tree. It passed halfway through the trunk where it struck, quivering. He shot 9 bolts of energy from his palms, which killed the Urgles instantly, and then ripped his sword free and strode to the elf. Prophecies of revenge spoken in a wretched language only he knew rolled from his tongue. He clenched his thin hands and glared at the sky. The cold stars stared back, unwinking, otherworldly watchers. Disgust curled his lip before he turned back to the unconscious elf. Her beauty, which would have entranced any mortal man, held no charm for him. He confirmed that the stone was gone, and then retrieved his horse from its hiding place among the trees. After tying the elf onto the saddle, he mounted the charger and made his way out of the woods. He quenched the fires in his path, but left the rest to burn. Chapter 1. Discovery. Eragon knelt in a bed of trampled reed grass and scanned the tracks with a practiced eye. The prince told him that the deer had been in the meadow only a half hour before. Soon they would bed down. His target, a small doe with a pronounced limp in her left forefoot, was still with the herd. He was amazed she had made it so far without a wolf or a bear catching her. The sky was clear and dark, and a slight breeze stirred the air. A silvery cloud drifted over the mountains that surrounded him, its edges glowing with ruddy light cast from the harvest moon cradled between 2 peaks. Streams flowed down from the mountains, from stolid glaciers and glistening snowpacks. A brooding mist crept along the valley's floor, almost thick enough to obscure his feet. Eragon was 15, less than a year from manhood. Dark eyebrows rested above his intense brown eyes. His clothes were worn from work. A hunting knife with a bone handle was sheathed at his belt, and a buckskin tube protected his yew bow from the mist. He carried a wood frame pack. The deer had led him deep into the spine, a range of untamed mountains that extended up and down the lands of Aglasia. Strange tales and men often came from those mountains, usually boding ill. Despite that, Eragon did not fear the spine. He was the only hunter near Caraval who dared track game deep into its craggy recesses. It was the 3rd night of the hunt, and his food was half gone. If he did not fell the doe, he would be forced to return home empty-handed. His family needed the meat for the rapidly approaching winter, and he could not afford to buy it in Carvajal. Eragon stood with quiet assurance in the dusky moonlight, and then strode into the forest toward a glen where he was sure the deer would rest. The trees blocked the sky from view and cast feathery shadows on the ground. He looked at the tracks only occasionally, and he knew the way. At the glen, he strung his bow with a sure touch, and then drew 3 arrows and nocked one, holding the others in his left hand. The moonlight revealed 20 or so motionless lumps where the deer lay in the grass. The doe he wanted was at the edge of the herd, her left foreleg stretched out awkwardly. Eragon slowly crept closer, keeping the bow ready. All his work of the past 3 days had led to this moment. He took a last steadying breath, and an explosion shattered the night. The herd bolted. Eragon lunged forward, racing through the grass as fiery wind surged past his cheek. He slid to a stop and loosed an arrow at the bounding doe, and it missed by a finger's breadth and hissed into the darkness. He cursed and spun around, instinctively nocking another arrow. Behind him, where the deer had been, smoldered a large circle of grass and trees. Many of the pines stood bare of their needles. The grass outside the charring was flattened. A wisp of smoke curled in the air, carrying a burnt smell. And in the center of the blast radius lay a polished blue stone. Mist snaked across the scorched area and swirled in substantial tendrils over the stone. Eragon watched for danger for several long minutes, but the only thing that moved was the mist. Cautiously, he released attention from his bow and moved forward. Moonlight cast him in a pale shadow as he stopped before the stone. He nudged it with an arrow and then jumped back. Nothing happened, so he warily picked it up. Nature had never polished a stone as smooth as this one. Its flawless surface was dark blue, except for thin veins of white that spiderwebbed across it. The stone was cool and frictionless under his hands, like hardened silk. Oval and about a foot long, it weighed several pounds, though it felt lighter than it should have. Eragon found the stone both beautiful and frightening. Where did it come from? Does it have a purpose? And then a more disturbing thought came to him. Was it sent here by accident, or am I meant to have it? If he had learned anything from the old stories, it was to treat magic, and those who used it, with great caution. But what should I do with the stone? It would be tiresome to carry, and there was a chance it was dangerous. It might be better to leave it behind. A flicker of indecision ran through him, and he almost dropped it, but something stayed in his hand. At the very least, it might pay for some food. He decided with a shrug and tucked the stone into his pack. The glen was too exposed to make a safe camp, so he slipped back into the forest and spread his bedroll beneath the upturned roots of a fallen tree. After a cold dinner of bread and cheese, he wrapped himself in blankets and fell asleep, pondering what had occurred. Chapter 2. Palancar Valley. The sun rose the next morning with a glorious conflagration of pink and yellow. The air was fresh, sweet, and very cold. Ice edged the streams, and small pools were completely frozen over. After a breakfast of porridge, Eragon returned to the glen and examined the charred area. The morning light revealed no new details, and so he started for home. The rough game trail was faintly worn and in places non-existent. Because it had been forged by animals, it often backtracked and took long detours. Yet for all its flaws, it was still the fastest way out of the mountains. The spine was one of the only places that King Galbatorix could not call his own. Stories were told about how half his army disappeared after marching into its ancient forest. A cloud of misfortune and bad luck seemed to hang over it. Though the trees grew tall and the sky shone brightly, few people could stay in the spine for long without suffering an accident. Eragon was one of those few. Not through any particular gift, it seemed to him, but because of persistent vigilance and sharp reflexes. He had hiked in the mountain for years, yet he was still wary of them. Every time he thought that they had surrendered their secrets, something happened to upset his understanding of them, like the stone's appearance. He kept up a brisk pace, and the league steadily disappeared. In late evening, he arrived at the edge of the precipitous ravine. The Enora River rushed by far below, heading to Palancar Valley. Gorged with hundreds of tiny streams, the river was a brute force battling along the rocks and boulders that barred its way. A low rumble filled the air. He camped in a thicket near the ravine and watched the moon rise before going to bed. It grew colder over the next day and a half. Eragon traveled quickly and saw little of the wary wildlife. A bit past noon, he heard the Igualda Falls blanketing everything with the dull sound of 1,000 splashes. The trail led him onto a moist slate outcropping, which the river sped past, flinging itself into empty air and down mossy cliffs. Before him lay Palancar Valley, exposed like an unrolled map. The base of Igualda Falls, more than half a mile below, was the northernmost point of the valley. A little ways from the falls was Carvajal, a cluster of brown buildings, white smoke from the chimneys, defiant of the wilderness around it. At this height, farms were small squares, patches no bigger than the end of his finger. The land around them was tan or sandy, where dead grass swayed in the wind. The Enora River wound from the falls toward Palancar's southern end, reflecting great strips of sunlight. Far in the distance, it flowed past the village, Theron's Ford, and in the lonely mountains Utgard. Beyond that, he knew only that it turned north and ran to the sea. After a pause, Eragon left the outcropping and started down the trail, grimacing at the descent. When he arrived at the bottom, soft dusk was creeping over everything, blurring colors and shapes into gray masses. Carvajal's light shimmered nearby in the twilight. The houses cast long shadows. Aside from Therinsford, Carvajal was the only village in Palancar Valley. The settlement was secluded and surrounded by harsh, beautiful land. Few traveled here except merchants and trappers. The village was composed of stout log buildings with low roofs, some thatched and others shingled. Smoke billowed from the chimneys, giving the air a woody smell. The buildings had wide porches where people gathered to talk and conduct business. Occasionally, a window brightened as a candle or lamp was lit. Eragon heard men talking loudly in the evening air, while wives scurried to fetch their husbands, scolding them for being late. Eragon wove his way between the houses to the butcher's shop, a broad, thick beam building. Overhead, the chimney belched black smoke. He pushed the door open, and the spacious room was warm and well lit by a fire snapping in a stone fireplace. A bare counter stretched across the far side of the room. The floor was strewn with loose straw. Everything was scrupulously clean, as if the owner spent his leisure time digging in obscure crannies for minuscule pieces of filth. Behind the counter stood the butcher Sloane, a small man. He wore a cotton shirt and long, blood-stained smock. An impressive array of knives swung from his belt. He had a swallow, pockmarked face, and his black eyes were suspicious. He polished the counter with a ragged cloth. Sloane's mouth twisted as Eragon entered. "Well, the mighty hunter joins the rest of us mortals. How many did you bag this time?" "None," was Eragon's curt reply. He had never liked Sloane. The butcher always treated him with disdain, as if he were something unclean. A widower. Sloane seemed to care for only one person, his daughter, Katrina, on whom he doted. "Oh, I am amazed," said Sloane with affected astonishment. He turned his back on Eragon to scrape something off the wall. "And that's your reason for coming here?" "Yes," admitted Eragon uncomfortably. "Well, if that's the case, let's see your money." Sloane tapped his fingers when Eragon shifted his feet and remained silent. "Well, come on. You either have it or you don't. Which is it?" "I don't really have any money, but I do." "What? No money? And you expect to buy meat? Are the other merchants giving away the wares? Should I just hand you the goods without charge? Besides, it's late. Come back tomorrow with money. I'm closed for the day." "I can't wait until tomorrow, Sloane. It'll be worth your while, though. I found something to pay you with." He pulled out the stone, and with a flourish set it gently on the scarred counter, where it gleamed with light from the dancing flames. "Stole it is more likely," muttered Sloane, leaning forward with an interested expression. Ignoring the comment, Eragon asked, "Will this be enough?" Sloane picked up the stone and gouged its weight suspectively. He ran his hands over its smoothness and inspected the white veins. With a calculating look, he set it down. "I mean, it's pretty. But how much is it worth?" "I don't know, but no one would have gone to the trouble of shaping it unless if it had some value." "Well, obviously. But how much value? Since you don't know, I suggest that you find a trader who does, or take my offer of 3 crowns. "That's a miser's bargain! It must be worth at least 10 times that." 3 crowns would not even be enough to buy meat to last a week. Sloane shrugged. "Well, if you don't like my offer, wait until the traders arrive. Either way, I'm tired of this conversation." Traders were a nomadic group of merchants and entertainers who visited Carvajal every spring and winter. They brought whatever excess the villagers and local farmers had managed to grow or make, and sold what they needed to live through another year. Seeds, animals, fabric, and supplies like salt and sugar. But Eragon did not want to wait until they arrived. It could be a while, and his family needed the meat now. "Fine, I accept." "Oh, good. I'll get you the meat. Not that it matters. Where did you find this?" 2 nights ago in the spine." "Get out!" He pushed the stone away. He stomped furiously to the end of the counter and started scrubbing out bloodstains off a knife. "Why?" He drew the stone closer as if to protect it from Sloane's wrath. "I won't take anything you bring back from those damn mountains. Take your sorcerer's stone elsewhere." Sloane's hand suddenly slipped and he cut a finger on the knife, but he seemed not to notice. He continued to scrub, staining the blade with fresh blood. You refuse to sell to me. Yes, unless you pay with coins. Go, before I make you. The door behind them slammed open. Eragon whirled around, ready for more trouble. In stomped Horst, a hulking man. Sloane's daughter, Katrina, a tall girl of 16, trailed behind him with a determined expression. Eragon was surprised to see her. She usually absented herself from any arguments involving her father. Sloane glanced at them warily, and then started to accuse Eragon. Well, he won't quiet, announced Horst in a rumbling voice, cracking his knuckles at the same time. He was Carval's smith, and as his thick neck and scarred leather apron attested. His powerful arms were bare to the elbow. A great expanse of hairy, muscular chest was visible through the top of his shirt. A black beard, carelessly trimmed, roiled and knotted like his jaw muscles. Sloane, what have you done now? Nothing. This boy came in here and started badgering me. I asked him to leave, but he won't budge. I even threatened him, and he still ignored me. Is this true? No! I offered this stone as payment for some meat, and he accepted it. When I told him that I'd found it in the spine, he refused to even touch it. What difference does it make where it came from? Horst looked at the stone curiously, and then returned his attention to the butcher. Why won't you trade with him, Sloane? I've no love for the spine myself, but if it's a question of the stone's worth, I'll back it with my own money. The question hung in the air for a moment, then Sloane licked his lips and said, This is my store. I can do whatever I want. Katrina stepped out from behind Horst and tossed back her auburn hair like a spray of molten copper. Father, Eragon is willing to pay. Give him the meat, and then we can have supper. Sloane's eyes narrowed dangerously. Go back to the house. This is none of your business. I said go. Katrina's face hardened, and then she marched out of the room with a stiff back. Eragon watched with disapproval, but dared not interfere. Horst tugged at his beard before saying reproachfully, Fine. You can deal with me. Where are you going to get Eragon? His voice reverberates through the room. As much as I could. Horst pulls out a purse and counted out a pile of coins. Give me your best roast and steaks. Make sure that it's enough to fill Eragon's pack. Butcher hesitated, his gaze darting between Horst and Eragon. Not selling to me would be a very bad idea. Glowering venomously, Sloane slipped back into the room. A frenzy of chopping, rapping, and low cursing reached them. After several uncomfortable minutes, he returned with an armful of wrapped meat. His face was expressionless as he accepted Horst's money, and then proceeded to clean his knife, pretending that they were not there. Horst scooped up the meat and walked outside. Eragon hurried behind him, carrying his pack and the stone. The crisp night air rolled over their faces, refreshing under the stuffy shop. Thank you, Horst. Uncle Garrow will be pleased. Horst laughed quietly. Don't thank me. Wanted to do that for a long time. Sloane's a vicious troublemaker. Does him good to be humbled. Katrina heard what was happening and ran to fetch me. Good thing I came. The two of you were almost at blows. Unfortunately, I doubt he'll serve you or any of your family the next time you go in there, even if you do have coins. Why did he explode like that? We've never been friendly, but he's always taken our money, and I've never seen him treat Katrina that way. Ask your uncle. He knows more about it than I do. Eragon stuffed the meat into his pack. Well, now I have one more reason to hurry home. To solve this mystery. Here, this is rightfully yours. He pre-offered the stone, and Horst chuckled. Nah, keep your strange rock. As for payment, Albrecht plans to leave for Feinster next spring. He wants to become a master smith, and I'm going to need an assistant. You can come and work off the dead on your spare days. Eragon bowed slightly, delighted. Horst had 2 sons, Albrecht and Baldur, both of whom worked in his forge. Taking one's place was a generous offer. Again, thank you. I look forward to working with you. He was glad that there was a way for him to pay Horst. His uncle would never accept charity. And then Eragon remembered what his cousin had told him before he left on the hunt. Rorin wanted me to give Katrina a message, but since I can't, can you get it to her? Well, of course. He wants her to know that he'll come into town as soon as the merchants arrive, and then he will see her then. That all? Eragon was slightly embarrassed. No. He also wants her to know that she is the most beautiful girl he has ever seen and that he thinks of nothing else. Horse's face broke into a broad grin, and he winked at Eragon. Getting serious, isn't he? Yes, sir, Eragon announced with a quick smile. Could you also give her my thanks? It was nice of her to stand up to her father for me, and I hope that she isn't punished because of it. Roran would be furious if I got her in trouble. Nah, I wouldn't worry about it. Sloane doesn't know that she even called me, so I doubt it'll be too hard on her. Before you go, will you step with us? I'm sorry, but I can't. Garrow is expecting me. Eragon tied off the top of the pack, hoisted it onto his back, and started down the road, raising his hand in farewell. Ooh. Thank you so much for following. It's about to be an ad, so just give me a second. I'm going to run that, and then I'll get back to reading. Also, hello to the person who chatted. Okay. The meat slowed him down, but he was eager to be home, and with renewed vigor filled his steps. The village ended abruptly, and he left its warm lights behind. The pearlescent moon peeked over the mountains, bathing the land in a ghostly reflection of daylight. Everything looked bleached and flat. Near the end of his journey, he turned off the road, which continued south. A simple path led straight through the waist-high grass and up a knoll, almost hidden by the shadows of protective elm trees. He crested the hill and saw a gentle light shining from his home. The house had a shingled roof and a brick chimney. Eaves hung over the whitewashed walls, shadowing the ground below. One side of the enclosed porch was filled with split wood, ready for the fire. A jumble of farm tools cluttered the other side. The house had been abandoned for half a century when they moved in after Garrow's wife, Marion, died. It was 10 miles from Caraval, farther than anyone else's. People considered the distance dangerous because the family could not rely on help from the village in times of trouble. But Eragon's uncle would not listen. 100 feet from the house, in dull-colored barn, lived 2 horses, Burka and Brew, with chickens and a cow. Sometimes there was also a pig, but they had been unable to afford one this year. A wagon sat wedged between the stalls. On the edge of their fields, a thick line of trees traced along the Enora River. He saw a light move behind a window as he wearily reached the porch. Uncle, it's Eragon. Let me in. A small shutter slid back for a second, and then the door swung inward. Garrow stood with his hand on the door. His worn clothes hung on him like rags on a stick frame. A lean, hungry face with intense eyes gazed out from under graying hair. He looked like a man who had been partly mummified before it was discovered that he was still alive. Roran's sleeping, was his answer to Eragon's inquiring glance. A lantern flickered on the wood table, so old that the grain stood up in tiny ridges like a giant fingerprint. Near a wood stove were rows of cooking utensils tacked onto the wall with homemade nails. A second door opened to the rest of the house. The floor was made of boards polished smooth by years of tramping feet. Eragon pulled off his pack and took out the meat. What's this? Did you buy meat? Where did you get the money? Asked his uncle harshly as he saw the wrap packages. Eragon took a breath before answering. No, Horse bought it for us. You let him pay for it? I told you before. I will not beg for our food. If we can't feed ourselves, we might as well move into town. Before you can turn around twice, they'll be sending us used clothes and asking if we'll be able to get through the winter. Garrow's face paled with anger. I didn't accept charity. Horst agreed to let me work off the debt this spring. He needs someone to help him because Albrecht is going away. And where will you get the time to work for him? Are you going to ignore all the things that need to be done here? Eragon hung his bow and quiver on the hooks beside the front door. I don't know how I'll do it. Besides, I found something that could be worth some money. He set the stone on the table. Garrow bowed over it. The hungry look on his face became ravenous, and his fingers moved with a strange twitch. You found this in the spine? Yes, said Eragon. He explained what had happened. And to make matters worse, I lost my best arrow. I'll have to make more before long. They stared at the stone in the near darkness. How was the weather? Asked his uncle, lifting the stone. His hands tightened around it like he was afraid it would suddenly disappear. Cold. Didn't snow, but it froze each night. Garrow looked worried by the news. Tomorrow you'll have to help Roran finish harvesting the barley. If we can get the squash picked too, the frost won't bother us. He passed the stone to Eragon. Here, keep it. When the traders come, we'll find out what it's worth. Selling it is probably the best thing to do. The less we're involved with magic, the better. Why did Horst pay for the meat? It took only a moment for Eragon to explain his argument with Sloane. I just don't understand what angered him so. Garrow shrugged. Sloane's wife, Ismira, went over to the Igualda Falls a year before you were brought here. He hasn't been near the spine since, nor had anything to do with it. That's no reason to refuse payment. I think he just wanted to give you trouble. Eragon swayed blearily and said, Well, it's good to be back. Garrow's eyes softened and he nodded. Eragon stumbled to his room, pushed the stone under his bed, and then fell onto the mattress. Home. For the first time since before the hunt, he relaxed completely as sleep overtook him. Chapter 3. Dragon Tales. At dawn, the sun's rays streamed through the window, warming Eragon's face. Rubbing his eyes, he sat up on the edge of the bed. The pine floor was cold under his feet, and he stretched his sore legs and rubbed his back, yawning. Besides the bed was a row of shelves covered with objects he had collected. There were twisted pieces of wood, odd bits of shells, rocks that had broken to reveal shiny interiors, and strips of dry grass tied into knots. His favorite item was a root so convoluted he never tired of looking at it. The rest of the room was bare, except for a small dresser and a nightstand. He pulled on his boots and stared at the floor, thinking. This was a special day. It was near this very hour, 16 years ago, that his mother, Selena, had come home to Caraval, alone and pregnant. She had been gone 6 years, living in the cities, and when she returned, she wore expensive clothes, and her hair was bound by a net of pearls. She had sought out her brother, Garrow, and asked to stay with him until the baby arrived. Within 5 months, her son was born. Everyone was shocked when Selena tearfully begged Garrow and Marion to raise him. When they asked why, she only wept and said, I must. Her pleas had grown increasingly desperate until they finally agreed. She named him Eragon, and then departed early the next morning and never returned. Eragon still remembered how he felt when Marion told him the story before she died. The realization that Garrow and Marion were not his real parents had disturbed him greatly. Things that had been permanent and unquestionable were suddenly thrown into doubt. Eventually, he had learned to live with it, but he always had a nagging suspicion that he had not been good enough for his mother. I'm sure there was a reason for what she did. I just only wish I knew what it was. One other thing bothered him. Who was his father? Selena had told no one, and whoever it might be had never come looking for Eragon. He wished that he knew who it was, if only to have a name. It would be nice to know his heritage. He sighed and went to the nightstand, where he splashed his face, shivering as the water ran down his neck. Refreshed, he retrieved the stone from under the bed and set it on the shelf. The morning light caressed it, throwing a warm shadow on the wall. He touched it one more time, and then hurried to the kitchen, eager to see his family. Garrow and Roran were already there, eating chicken. As Eragon greeted them, Roran stood with a grin. Roran was 2 years older than Eragon, muscular, sturdy, and careful with his movements. They could not have been closer, even if they had been real brothers. Roran smiled. Ah, I'm glad you're back. How was the trip? Hard. Did Uncle tell you what happened? He helped himself to a piece of chicken, which he devoured hungrily. No. And the story was told quickly. At Roran's insistence, Eragon left his food to show him the stone. This elicited a satisfactory amount of awe, but Roran soon asked nervously, were you able to talk with Katrina? No, there wasn't an opportunity after the argument with Sloane, but she'll expect you when the traders come. I gave the message to Horst. He'll get it to her. You told Horst? That was private. If I wanted everyone to know about it, I could have built a bonfire and used smoke signals to communicate. God, if Sloane finds out, he won't let me see her again. Oh, Horst will be discreet. He won't let anyone fall prey to Sloane, least of all you. Roran seemed unconvinced, but argued no more. They returned to their meals in the tactum presence of Garrow. When the last bites were finished, all three went to work out in the fields. The sun was cold and pale, providing little comfort. Under its watchful eye, the last of the barley was stored in the barn. Next they gathered prickly vine squash, then the rutabagas, then beets and peas and turnips and beans, which they packed into the root cellar. After hours of labor, they stretched their cramped muscles, pleased that the harvest was finished. The following days were spent pickling, salting, shelling, and preparing the food for winter. 9 days after Eragon's return, a vicious blizzard blew out of the mountains and settled over the valley. The snow came down in great sheets, blanketing the countryside in white. They only dared leave the house for firewood and to feed the animals, for they feared getting lost in the howling wind and featureless landscape. They spent their time huddled over the stove as gusts rattled the heavy window shutters. Days later, when the storm finally passed, revealing an alien world of soft white drifts. I'm afraid the traders might not come this year with conditions this bad. They're late as it is. We'll give them a chance and wait before going to Carvajal, but if they don't show, we'll soon have to buy any spare supplies from the townspeople. His countenance was resigned. They grew anxious as the days crept by without sign of the traders. Talk was sparse and depression hung over the house. On the 8th morning, Roran walked to the road and confirmed that the traders had not yet passed. The day was spent readying for the trip into Carvajal, scrounging with grim expressions for saleable items. That evening, out of desperation, Eragon checked the road again. He found deep ruts cut into the snow, with numerous hoofprints between them. Elated, he ran back to the house, whooping, bringing new life to preparations. They packed their supplies, produce, into the wagon before sunrise. Garrow put the year's money in a leather pouch that he carefully fastened to his belt. Eragon set the wrapped stone between bags of grain so it would not roll when the wagon hit bumps. After a hasty breakfast, they harnessed the horses and cleared a path to the road. The traders' wagons had already broken the drifts which sped their progress, but by noon they could see Carvajal. In daylight, it was a small earthy village filled with shouts and laughter. The traders had made camp in an empty field on the outskirts of town. Groups of wagons, tents, and fires were randomly spread across it, spots of color against the snow. The troubadours' 4 tents were garnishly decorated. A steady stream of people linked the camp to the village. Crowds churned around a light of bright tents and booths clogging the main street. Horses whinnied at the noise, and the snow had been pounded flat, giving it a glassy surface. Elsewhere, bonfires had melted it. Roasted hazelnuts added a rich aroma to the smells wafting around them. Garrow parked the wagon and picked it at the horses, then drew coins from his pouch. Get yourself some treats. Roran, do what you want, only be at horse in time for supper. Eragon, bring that stone and come with me. Eragon grinned at Roran and pocketed the money, already planning how to spend it. Roran departed immediately with a determined expression on his face. Garrow led Eragon into the throng, shouldering his way through the bustle. Women were buying cloth, while nearby their husbands examined a new latch, hook, or tool. Children ran up and down the road, shrieking with excitement. Knives were displayed here, spices there, and pots were laid out in shiny rows next to leather harnesses. Eragon stared at the traders curiously. They seemed less prosperous this year. Their children had a frightened, wary look, and their clothes were patched. The gaunt men carried swords and daggers with a new familiarity, and even the women had poniards belted at their waist. Poniards belted at their waist. What could have happened to make them like this? Why are they so late? Wondered Eragon. He remembered the traders as being full of good cheer, but there was none of that now. Garrow pushed down the street, searching for Murlock, a trader who specialized in odd trinkets and pieces of jewelry. They found him behind a booth, displaying brooches to a group of women, and as each new piece was revealed, exclamations of admiration followed. Eragon guesses that more than a few purses would soon be depleted. Murloc seemed to flourish and grow every time his wares were complimented. He wore a goatee, held himself with ease, and seemed to regard the rest of the world with slight contempt. The excited group prevented Garrow and Eragon from getting near the traitor, so they settled on a step and waited. As soon as Murloc was unoccupied, they hurried over. "And what might you stirs want to look at? An amulet? Or a trinket for a lady?" With a twirl, he pulled out a delicately carved silver rose of excellent workmanship. The polished metal caught Eragon's attention, and he eyed it appreciatively. The trader continued, "Not even 3 crowns, though it has come all the way from famed craftsman Bellatona." Garrow spoke in a quiet voice. "We aren't looking to buy, but to sell." Murloc immediately covered the rose and looked at them with new interest. "Oh, well, I see. Maybe if this item is of any value, you would like to trade it for 1 or 2 of these exquisite pieces." He paused for a moment while Eragon and his uncle stood uncomfortably, and then continued. "Well, you did bring the object of consideration." "We have it, but we'd rather you show it to you elsewhere." Murloc raised an eyebrow, but spoke smoothly. "Well, in that case, let me invite you to my tent." He gathered up his wares and gently laid them in an iron-bound chest, which he locked. Then he ushered them up the street and into the temporary camp. They wound between the wagons to a tent removed from the rest of the traders. It was crimson at the top and sable at the bottom, with thin triangles of color stabbing into each other. Murloc untied the opening and swung the flap to one side. Small trinkets and strange pieces of furniture, such as a round bend and 3 set seats carved from tree stumps, filled the tent. A gnarled dagger with a ruby in the pommel rested on a white cushion. Murloc closed the flap and turned to them. "Please, seat yourselves." When they had, he said, "Now, show me. Why are we meeting in private?" Eragon unwrapped the stone and set it between the 2 men. Murloc reached for it with a gleam in his eye, and then stopped and asked, "May I?" When Garrow indicated his approval, Murloc picked it up. He put the stone in his lap and reached to one side for a thin box. Opened it, revealed a large set of copper scales, which he set on the ground. After weighing the stone, he scrutinized its surface under a jeweler's gaze, tapped it gently with a wooden mallet, and drew the point of a tiny clear stone over it. He measured its length and diameter, and then recorded the fingers on a slate. He considered the results for a while. "And do you know what it is worth?" "No," admitted Garrow. His cheek twitched as he shifted uncomfortably on the seat. Murloc grimaced. "Unfortunately, neither do I. But I can tell you this much. The white veins are the same material as the blue that surrounds them, only a different color. What that material might be, though, I haven't a clue. It's harder than any rock I have seen. Harder even than diamond. Whoever shaped it used tools I have never seen. Or magic. But also, it's hollow." "What?" An irritated edge crept into Murloc's voice. "Did you ever hear a rock sound like this?" He grabbed the dagger from the cushion and slapped the stone with the flat of the blade. A pure note filled the air and then faded away smoothly. Eragon was alarmed, afraid that the stone had been damaged. Murloc tilted the stone toward them. "You will find no scratches or blemishes where the dagger struck. I doubt I could do anything to harm the stone, even if I took a hammer to it." Garrow crossed his arms with a reserved expression. A wall of silence surrounded him. Eragon was puzzled. "I knew that the stone appeared in the spine through magic. But made by magic? What for and why?" He blurted, "But what is it worth?" "I can't tell you that. I am sure there are people who would pay dearly to have it, but none of them are here in Carvajal. You would have to go to the southern cities to find a buyer. This is a curiosity for most people, not an item to spend money on when practical things are needed." Garrow stared at the tent ceiling like a gambler calculating the odds. "Will you buy it?" The trader answered instantly. "It's not worth the risk. I might be able to find a wealthy buyer during my spring travels, but I can't be certain. And even if I did, you wouldn't be paid until I return next year. No, you will have to find someone else to trade with. I am curious, however, why did you insist on talking to me in private?" Eragon put the stone away before answering. Because, and he glanced at the man, wondering if he would explode like Sloane. I found this in the spine, and folks around here don't like that. Murloc gave him a startled look. Do you know why my fellow merchants and I were late this year? Eragon shook his head. Our wanderings have been dogged with misfortune. Chaos seems to rule the Glacia. We could not afford illness, attacks, and the most cursed bad luck we cannot avoid. Because the Varden's attacks have increased, Galbatorix has forced cities to send more soldiers to the borders, men who are needed to combat the Urgles. The brutes have been migrating southeast, towards the Haderach Desert. No one knows why, and it wouldn't concern us, except that they're passing through populated areas. They've been spotted on roads and near cities. And worst of all, the reports of a shade. Though the stories are unconfirmed, not many people survive such an encounter. Why haven't we heard of this? Because it only began a few months ago. Whole villages have been forced to move because Urgles destroyed their fields and starvation threatens. Nonsense. We haven't seen any Urgles. The only one around here has his horns mounted in Morn's tavern. Murloc arched an eyebrow. Maybe so. This is a small village hidden by mountains. It's not surprising that you've escaped notice. However, I wouldn't expect that to last. I only mention this because strange things are happening here as well if you found such a stone in the spine. With that sobering statement, he bid them farewell with a bow and a slight smile. Garrow headed back to Carvajal with Eragon trailing behind. What do you think? I'm going to get more information before I make up my mind. Take the stone back to the wagon and then do what you want. I'll meet you for dinner at Horse. Eragon dodged the crowd and happily dashed back to the wagon. Trading would take his uncle hours, time that he had planned to enjoy fully. He hid the stone under the bags and then set out into town with a cocky stride. He walked from one booth to another, evaluating the goods with a buyer's eye, despite his meager supply of coins. And when he talked with the merchants, they confirmed what Murloc had said about the instability in the Glacia. Over and over, the message was repeated. Last year's security had deserted us. New dangers have appeared, and nothing is safe. Later in the day, he bought 3 sticks of malt candy and a small piping hot cherry pie. The hot food felt good after hours of standing in the snow. He licked the sticky syrup from his fingers regretfully, wishing for more, and then sat on the edge of a porch and nibbled a piece of candy. Two boys from Carvajal rested nearby, but he felt no inclination to join them. As the day descended into late afternoon, the traders took their business into people's homes. Eragon was impatient for evening, when the troubadours would come out to tell stories and perform tricks. He loved hearing about magic and gods, and, if they were especially lucky, the dragon riders. Carvajal had its own storyteller, Brom, a friend of Eragon's, but his tales grew old over the years, whereas the troubadours always had new ones that he listened to eagerly. Eragon had just broken off an icicle from the underside of a porch when he spotted Sloane nearby. The butcher had not seen him, so Eragon ducked his head and bolted around a corner towards Morn's tavern. The inside was hot and filled with greasy smoke from sputtering tallow candles. The shiny black Urgle horns, their twisted span as great as his outstretched arms, were mounted over the door. The bar was long and low, with a stack of staves on one end for customers to carve. Morn tended to the bar, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The bottom half of his face was short and mashed, as if he had rested his chin on a grinding wheel. People crowded solid oak tables and listened to 2 traders who had finished their business early and had come in for a beer. Morn looked up from a mug he was cleaning. Eragon, good to see you. Where's your uncle? Buying. He's gonna be a while. And Roran, is he here? Asked Morn as he swiped the cloth through another mug. Yes, no sick animals to keep him back this year. Good, good. Eragon gestured at the 2 traders. Who are they? Grain buyers. They bought everyone's seed at ridiculously low prices, and now they're telling wild stories, expecting us to believe them. Eragon understood why Morn was so upset. People need that money. You can't go by without it. What kind of stories? Morn snorted. They say the Varden have formed a pact with the Urgles and are massing an army to attack us. Supposedly, it's only through the grace of our king that we've been protected for so long. As if Galbatorix would care if we burned to the ground. Go listen to him. I have enough on my hands without explaining their lies. The first trader filled a chair with his enormous girth. His every movement caused it to protest loudly. There was no hint of hair on his face. His pudgy hands were baby smooth, as if he had pouting lips that curled petulantly as he sipped from a flagon. The second man had a florid face. The skin around his jaw was dry and corpulent, filled with lumps of hard fat, like cold butter had gone rancid. Contrasted with his neck and jowls, the rest of his body was unnaturally thin. The first trader vainly tried to pull back his expanding borders to fit within the chair. He said, "Oh, no, no, you don't understand. It is only through the king's unceasing efforts on your behalf that you were able to argue with us in safety. If he, in all his wisdom, were to withdraw that support, woe unto you." Someone hollered. "Right. Why don't you also tell us the riders have returned and you've each killed 100 elves? Do you think we're children to believe in your tales? We can take care of ourselves." And the group chuckled. The trader started to reply when his thin companion intervened with a wave of his hand. Gaudy jewels flashed on his fingers. "You misunderstand. We know the Empire cannot care for each of us personally, as you may want, but it can keep Urgles and the other abominations from overrunning this." He searched vaguely for the right term. "Place," the trader continued. "You're angry with the Empire for treating people unfairly, a legitimate concern, but a government cannot please everyone. There will inevitably be arguments and conflicts. However, the majority of us have nothing to complain about. Every country has some small group of malcontents who aren't satisfied with the balance of power." "Yeah, if you're willing to call the Varden small," and the fat man sighed. "We already explained the Varden have no interest in helping you. That's only a falsehood perpetuated by the traitors in an attempt to disrupt the Empire and convince us that the real threat is inside, not outside, our borders. All they want to do is overthrow the king and take possession of our land. They have spies everywhere as they prepare to invade. You never know who might be working for them." Eragon did not agree, but the trader's words were smooth and people were nodding. He stepped forward and said, "How do you know this? I can say that the clouds are green, but that doesn't mean it's true. Prove you aren't lying." The two men glared at him while the villagers waited silently for an answer. The thin trader spoke first, and he avoided Eragon's eyes. "Aren't your children taught respect? Or do you let boys challenge men whenever they want to?" The listeners fidgeted and stared at Eragon, and then a man said, "Answer the question." "Oh, well, it's only common sense," said the fat one, sweat beading on his upper lip. His reply riled the villagers, and the dispute resumed. Eragon returned to the bar with a sour taste in his mouth. He had never before met anyone who favored the Empire and tore down its enemies. There was a deep-seated hatred for the Empire in Carvajal, almost hereditary in nature. The Empire never helped them during harsh years when they nearly starved, and its tax collectors were heartless. He felt justified in disagreeing with the traitors regarding the king's mercy, but he did not speculate about the Varden. The Varden were a rebel group that constantly raided and attacked the Empire. It was a mystery who their leader was, or who had formed them in the years following Galbatorix's rise to power over a century ago. The group had garnered much sympathy as they eluded Galbatorix's effort to destroy them. Little was known about the Varden except that if you were a fugitive and had to hide, or if you hated the Empire, they would accept you. The only problem was finding them. Morn leaned over the bar and said, "Incredible, isn't it? They're worse than vultures circling a dying animal. There's going to be trouble if they stay much longer." "For us or for them?" "Them," said Morn as angry voices filled the tavern. Eragon left when the argument threatened to become violent. The door thudded shut behind him, cutting off the voices. It was early evening and the sun was sinking rapidly. The houses cast long shadows on the ground as Eragon headed down the street. He noticed Roran and Katrina standing in an alley. Roran said something that Eragon could not hear. Katrina looked down at her hands and answered in an undertone, then leaned up on her tiptoes and kissed him before darting away. Eragon trotted to Roran and teased. "Having a good time?" Roran grunted noncommittally as he paced away. "Have you heard the trader's news?" asked Eragon, following. Most of the villagers were indoors, talking to traders or waiting until it was dark enough for the troubadours to perform. "Yeah. What do you think of Sloane?" "Oh, well, I thought it was obvious." "Oh, God, there will be blood between us when he finds out about Katrina and me." A snowflake landed on Eragon's nose, and he looked up. The sky had turned gray. could think of nothing appropriate to say because Rorn was right. He clasped his cousin on the shoulder as they continued down this byway. Dinner at Horse was hearty. The room was full of conversation and laughter. Sweet cordials and heavy ales were consumed in copious amounts, adding to the boisterous atmosphere. When the plates were empty, Horace's guests left the house and strolled to the field where the traders were camped. A ring of poles, topped with candles, had been struck into the ground around a large clearing. Bonfires blazed in the background, painting the ground with dancing shadows. The villagers slowly gathered around a circle and waited expectantly in the cold. The troubadours came tumbling out of their tents, dressed in tasseled clothing, followed by older and more stately minstrels. The minstrels provided music and narration as their younger counterparts acted out the stories. The first plays were pure entertainment, bawdy and full of jokes, pratfalls, and ridiculous characters. Later, however, when the candles sputtered in their sockets and everyone was drawn together into a tight circle, the old storyteller Brom stepped forward. A knotted white beard dribbled over his chest, and a long black cape was wrapped around his bent shoulders, obscuring his body. He wrapped his arms with his hands that reached out like talons and recited thus. I'm gonna let the ad run real quick, 1 second. Okay. And we're back. Cool. He spread his arms with hands that reached out like talons and recited thus. The sands of time cannot be stopped. Years pass whether we will them or not, but we can remember. What has been lost may yet live on in memories. That which you will hear is imperfect and fragmented, yet treasure it, for without you it does not exist. I give you now a memory that has been forgotten, hidden in the dreamy haze that lies behind us. His keen eyes inspected their interested faces. His gaze lingered on Eragon last of all. Before your grandfather's fathers were born, and yeah, even before their fathers, the Dragon Riders were formed. To protect and guard was their mission, and for thousands of years they succeeded. Their prowess in battle was unmatched, for each held the strength of 10 men. They were immortal unless blade or poison took them. For good only were their powers used, and under their tutelage tall cities and towers were built out of living stone. While they kept peace, the land flourished. It was a golden time. The elves were our allies, the dwarves our friends. Wealth flowed into our cities, and men prospered. But weep, for it could not last. Brom looked down silently. Infinite sadness resonated in his voice. Though no enemy could destroy them, they could not guard against themselves. And it came to pass at the height of that power that a boy, Galbatorix by name, was born in the province of Inslabeth, which is no more. At 10 he was tested, as was the custom, and it was found that great power resided in him. The riders accepted him as one of their own. Through their training he passed, exceeding all others in skill. Gifted with a sharp mind and strong body, he quickly took his place among the riders' ranks. Some saw his abrupt rise as dangerous and warned the others, but the riders had grown arrogant in their power and ignored caution. Alas, sorrow was conceived that day. So it was that soon after his training was finished, Galbatorix took a reckless trip with two friends. Far north they flew, night and day, and passed into the Urgle's remaining territory, foolishly thinking their new powers would protect them. There, on a thick sheet of ice, unmelted even in summer, they were ambushed in their sleep. Though his friends and their dragons were butchered, and he suffered great wounds, Galbatorix slew his attackers. Tragically, during the fight, a stray arrow pierced his dragon's heart. Without the arts to save her, she died in his arms, and then were the seeds of madness planted. The storyteller clasped his hands and looked around slowly, shadows flickering across his worn face. The next words came like the mournful toll of a requiem. Alone, bereft of much of his strength and half mad with loss, Galbatorix wandered without hope in that desolate land, seeking death. It did not come to him, though he threw himself without fear against any living thing. Urgles and the other monsters soon fled from his haunted form. During this time, he came to realize that the riders might grant him another dragon. Driven by this thought, he began the arduous journey, on foot, back through the spine. Territory he had soared over effortlessly on a dragon's back now took him months to traverse. He could hunt with magic, but oftentimes he walked in places where animals did not travel. Thus, when his feet finally left the mountains, he was close to death. A farmer found him collapsed in the mud, and he summoned the riders. Unconscious, he was taken to their holdings, and his body healed. He slept for 4 days, and upon awakening, he gave no sign of his fevered mind. When he was brought before a council, convened to judge him, Galbatorix demanded another dragon. The desperation of the request revealed his dementia, and the council saw him for what he truly was. Denied his hope, Galbatorix, through the twisted mirror of his madness, came to believe it was the rider's fault that his dragon had died. Night after night, he brooded on that and formulated a plan to exact revenge. Bronzeword dropped to a mesmerizing whisper. He found a sympathetic rider, and there his insidious words took root. By persistent reasoning and the use of dark secrets learned from a shade, he inflamed the rider against their elders. Together, they treacherously lured and killed an elder. When the foul deed was done, Galbatorix turned on his ally and slaughtered him without warning. The riders found him then, with blood dripping from his hands. A scream tore from his lips, and he fled into the night. As he was cunning in his madness, they could not find him. For years he hid in wastelands like a hunted animal, always watching for pursuers. His atrocity was not forgotten, but over time searches ceased. Then, through some ill fortune, he met a young rider, Morzan, strong of body but weak of mind. Galbatorix convinced Morzan to leave a gate unbolted in the citadel of Illyria, which is now called Urban. Through this gate, Galbatorix entered and stole a dragon hatchling. He and his new disciple hid themselves in an evil place where the riders dared not venture. There, Morzan entered into a dark apprenticeship, learning secrets and forbidden magic that should never have been revealed. When his instruction was finished and Galbatorix's black dragon, Shuriken, was finally grown, Galbatorix revealed himself to the world, with Morzan at his side. Together they fought any rider they met. With each kill, their strength grew. 12 of the riders joined Galbatorix out of the desire for power and revenge against perceived wrongs. Those 12, with Morzan, became the 13 forsworn. The riders were unprepared, and fell beneath the onslaught. The elves, too, fought bitterly against Galbatorix, but they were overthrown and forced to flee to their secret places from whence they come no more. Only Vrail, leader of the riders, could resist Galbatorix and the forsworn. Ancient and wise, he struggled to save what he could and keep the remaining dragons from falling to his enemies. In the last battle, before the gates of Darurarba, Vrail defeated Galbatorix, but hesitated with the final blow. Galbatorix seized the moment and smote him in the side. Grievously wounded, Vrail fled to Eragon Mountain, where he hoped to gather strength. But it was not to be, for Galbatorix found him. And as they fought, Galbatorix kicked Vrail in the fork of his legs. With that underhanded blow, he gained dominance over Vrail and removed his head with a blazing sword. Then, as power rushed through his veins, Galbatorix anointed himself king of over all the Glacia. And from that day on, he has ruled us. With the completion of the story, Brom shuffled away with the troubadours. Eragon thought he saw a tear shining on his cheek. People murmured quietly to each other as they departed. Garros said to Eragon and Roran, "Consider yourselves fortunate. I have heard this tale only twice in my life. If the Empire knew that Brom had recited it, he would not live to see a new month." Thank y'all so much for joining me today. I hope y'all enjoyed. I will continue to read Eragon, and we'll just take this a couple chapters at a time. So I love y'all. Mwah, mwah, mwah. I hope you have a great day. Drink some water, eat some food, and get some sleeps.